Ayan, a bright college student with big dreams, found himself struggling with something that many others around him seemed to have mastered: English. He wanted to speak confidently, express his ideas clearly, and understand the world beyond his native language, but his limited vocabulary and difficulty in speaking fluently held him back. It wasn't that Ayan didn't want to improve. In fact, he yearned to be able to communicate effectively in English. However, every time he tried to speak or write in English, he was overwhelmed by the gap between his thoughts and his ability to express them. He often found himself looking for the right word or sentence, but it never came as quickly as he wished. Ayan's frustration only grew when he saw how easily his classmates and professors spoke English, making it seem like a natural extension of their thoughts. In class, they would discuss complex topics with ease, cracking jokes, and making their points sound so simple. He admired their fluency and found himself silently wishing he could do the same. But no matter how hard he tried, English always felt like a distant goal, something he couldn't quite reach. This constant cycle of disappointment weighed heavily on him. Ayan knew that to succeed in college and later in his career, mastering English was crucial. But it seemed like an insurmountable task, one that was always just out of reach. One evening, after a particularly frustrating group discussion, Ayan sat in his room, feeling defeated. He was trying to come up with a solution when he remembered something his professor had once said: "Improvement begins with small, consistent efforts." This simple phrase sparked an idea in his mind. What if he started with something small? What if he set a simple, attainable goal for himself every day? After thinking for a while, he came up with a plan. He would start by learning 5 new words every day. It sounded easy enough. 5 words didn't seem like too much to handle, and if he did this every day, over time, he would have a much larger vocabulary. Ayan decided to make it a daily ritual. He took a small notebook and wrote the date at the top of the page. Every day, he would find 5 new words, whether from a book he was reading, an article he came across online, or even a conversation with someone. He would write each word, its definition, and then use it in a sentence. It was a simple strategy, but it gave him structure and direction. The first few days felt difficult, but Ayan was determined. He sometimes found it hard to remember the words and struggled to come up with sentences that sounded right. He'd stare at the page for a while, frustrated that the words didn't come as easily as he hoped. But each time he got discouraged, he reminded himself of his goal: 5 words a day, no matter what. Gradually, as he continued, the words he had learned started to feel more familiar. He began using them in conversations, writing them in his assignments, and finding new ways to incorporate them into his daily life. Ayan soon realized that not only was his vocabulary expanding, but he was also developing a better understanding of how sentences in English were constructed. For example, he would notice how certain words fit together naturally, how some words had different meanings depending on the context, and how specific phrases were used in everyday speech. The more he practiced, the more he began to think in English. It no longer felt like an entirely foreign language. Instead, English was becoming a tool he could use to express his ideas. After a month of learning 5 new words daily, Ayan noticed a significant change. He had a much broader vocabulary, and he was able to use the words in conversations and writing without hesitation. However, Ayan knew that vocabulary was just one piece of the puzzle. If he truly wanted to become fluent, he also needed to work on his speaking and listening skills. He decided to take the next step in his journey: speaking practice. The idea of speaking English in front of others still made Ayan nervous. What if he made a mistake? What if his classmates laughed at him? These thoughts ran through his mind every time he thought about speaking in English in front of others. To overcome this, Ian started practicing in private. He would stand in front of a mirror, speak aloud, and repeat the sentences he had learned. At first, he felt silly and awkward. It was strange talking to himself, and he was embarrassed by how hesitant he sounded. But he didn't let that stop him. Every day, he practiced speaking aloud, repeating the sentences from his vocabulary notebook, and gradually, he grew more comfortable. The mirror became a space for him to rehearse, to experiment with different ways of speaking without judgment. Ian also began recording himself speaking. He would listen to the recordings afterward, paying attention to the areas where he stumbled or sounded unsure. This process helped him identify areas that needed improvement and gave him the motivation to keep practicing. Slowly but surely, his speaking skills improved. He felt more confident using English in conversations, even when his classmates would ask him questions. The more he practiced, the more natural it felt. Ian realized that speaking English wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, learning from mistakes, and improving over time. Encouraged by his progress, Ian decided to integrate more English into his daily routine. He loved reading about technology, gadgets, and the latest scientific discoveries, so he began reading articles, blogs, and news websites in English. This was another step in his learning process, as he didn't just passively read the words. He actively sought out new vocabulary and phrases. Every time he came across a word he didn't know, he would stop, write it down in his notebook, and look up its meaning. His goal was to not just read, but to learn from every piece of content he consumed. Watching English language videos and listening to podcasts on subjects that fascinated him became a daily habit. Ian found that the more he immersed himself in the language, the more he began to understand the rhythm, flow, and nuances of spoken English. He was able to pick up expressions, slang, and idioms that were often used by native speakers. This exposure to natural speech helped him bridge the gap between textbook English and the kind of casual, conversational English he wanted to use in everyday life. Listening practice became even more important as Ian sought to improve his comprehension skills. He joined an English-speaking group at college where students met weekly to practice their speaking and listening skills. Initially, he was intimidated by the fluency of others in the group. They seemed to speak without any hesitation, and Ian worried that he wouldn't be able to keep up. But over time, he found that the group was a supportive environment, and everyone there was eager to help each other improve. Ian began to participate more in the discussions, speaking up when it was his turn, and slowly his listening and comprehension skills improved as well. The more he listened to others, the better he understood the flow of conversation, and the more confident he became in speaking. To complement all of his practice, Ian started writing in English every day. He kept a journal where he would write about his day, his goals, and his thoughts. At first, his entries were simple, just a few sentences about what he had done or learned. But as his vocabulary grew, he began writing longer paragraphs, expressing more complex ideas and feelings. Writing in English became a way for him to reinforce everything he was learning. Each time he wrote, he used new words and phrases he had picked up, which helped solidify them in his memory. Ian found that writing also helped him organize his thoughts more clearly, making it easier for him to communicate his ideas both in writing and speaking. Months of consistent effort paid off. Ayan could now engage confidently in conversations, understand movies, TV shows, and podcasts in English, and write essays and reports with ease. He was no longer the hesitant student he once was. The English language had become a natural part of his life, a skill he used daily in both academic and social settings. Looking back at his journey, Ayan was proud of how far he had come. He had gone from struggling with basic words to confidently speaking, reading, listening, and writing in English. Ayan's story is a reminder that language learning doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and patience. But by starting small, staying consistent, and practicing daily, anyone can achieve their language goals. Just like Ayan, you can improve your English by setting small goals, making it a part of your daily routine, and constantly challenging yourself to do better. With determination, the language will no longer be a barrier, but a bridge to greater opportunities and connections. With a growing vocabulary, Ayan felt a newfound excitement to try speaking in English. For so long, he had been stuck at the point where he knew the words, but they wouldn't come out fluently when he needed them. He wanted to engage in conversations, to use the language as confidently as his classmates did. But the fear of making mistakes, of stumbling over his words, and of sounding unnatural held him back. Who could he practice with? Ayan didn't want to embarrass himself in front of others, especially since he still felt a bit unsure of his abilities. One evening, as Ayan sat at his desk, feeling frustrated about his lack of speaking practice, he remembered something his language instructor had once mentioned: "Don't be afraid to speak to yourself. Your reflection can be your first audience." It was a simple piece of advice, but it struck Ayan in a powerful way. The thought of practicing in front of others made him nervous, but practicing alone in the safety of his own room felt more manageable. Ayan decided to give it a try. The next morning, he stood in front of his mirror, feeling a little silly at first. He looked at his reflection, took a deep breath, and began to speak. He started by describing his day, as if he were explaining it to a friend. "Today, I woke up early and had a cup of coffee," he said to his reflection, trying to sound natural. "Then I went to the library to study for my exams. It was a productive day." At first, it felt awkward. He was not used to hearing his own voice speak English so loudly. But Ayan kept going, determined to push through the discomfort. He continued to describe more details of his day, practicing new words he had learned over the past few weeks. Slowly but surely, Ayan became more comfortable. His reflection, instead of judging him, became a silent but supportive listener. He realized that he could try different things with the mirror. Sometimes, he would talk about his plans for the future or his goals. Other times, he would make up short stories and tell them out loud. The more he practiced, the more confident he became in expressing himself in English. He would repeat sentences, trying to refine his pronunciation, experimenting with tone and pacing. He found that this kind of practice was invaluable. It was a safe space where he could make mistakes without fear of being judged. As weeks went by, Ayan's speaking ability continued to improve. His vocabulary expanded, and he felt more at ease using the words he had once struggled with. But there was still a challenge ahead. Ayan knew that to become truly fluent, he needed to practice speaking with others, not just by himself. Although the mirror was helping, He realized that engaging in real conversations would take his skills to the next level. One day, while hanging out with his friends, Ayan decided to take a leap of faith. He had been practicing English for months now, and his confidence had grown. The moment presented itself when one of his friends made a joke in English. Instead of staying silent or letting the opportunity slip away, Ayan responded. He added a comment to the conversation, and surprisingly, it came out naturally. He didn't stumble over his words. The sentence wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough, and his friend understood him. That small success boosted Ayan's confidence tremendously. From that day forward, he became more active in conversations. He stopped worrying too much about making mistakes. He understood that making mistakes was part of the process. Each error was a lesson that helped him improve further. Over time, Ayan became more comfortable speaking English not only with his friends but also with family members. At first, his parents were a little surprised to hear him speak in English at home. But Ayan didn't let that stop him. He would speak to them in English during meals or when discussing his day. Sometimes, they would ask him to explain a word or phrase, and Ayan would happily do so, using his new vocabulary. He even encouraged his younger sibling to join him in his practice. They would play language games together, which made the learning process even more fun. Ayan also found ways to practice speaking English outside of his immediate circle. He joined an online language exchange program where he was paired with native English speakers who were learning his native language. This was a fantastic opportunity for him to apply what he had learned and to get real-time feedback from others. Each session was a mini lesson in itself, as he would speak to his language partner about various topics, from hobbies to current events. These conversations were immensely helpful in improving his fluency, as he had to think quickly and respond on the spot. While Ayan had come a long way from the shy student who once hesitated to speak, there were still moments of doubt. Every now and then, he would feel the urge to give up. Sometimes, after hearing someone speak perfectly fluent English, Ayan would think, maybe I'll never reach that level. But then he would remember the small steps he had taken to get here, the words he had learned, and the hours of practice in front of the mirror. He realized that learning a language wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. It wasn't long before Ayan noticed another shift in his thinking. He began to see English not as a challenge or a barrier, but as a tool, a bridge to new opportunities, friendships, and experiences. He realized that he wasn't just learning a language for academic purposes. He was also learning to express his thoughts, dreams, and aspirations more effectively. English had become a key that unlocked doors to a world of possibilities. As his confidence grew, Ayan started to use English in more professional contexts as well. He would write emails to professors, participate in group discussions, and even deliver presentations in English. What once felt like an insurmountable mountain now seemed like a small hill he could easily climb. He knew that the more he practiced, the easier it would become. Every conversation, every article he read, every podcast he listened to, was another step toward fluency. One day, Ayan received an email from an international conference that was looking for student volunteers. The event would be conducted entirely in English. Normally, Ayan would have hesitated to apply, fearing that his English wasn't good enough. But this time, he felt confident. He responded to the email, expressing his interest, and before long, he was invited to volunteer. The experience was a turning point for him. Not only did he get the chance to interact with people from all over the world, but he also got the chance to practice speaking English in a professional setting. Ayan's confidence soared, and he knew he had come a long way since the days when he had been too nervous to speak. Reflecting on his journey, Ayan realized that the key to his success wasn't just the mirror practice or the vocabulary he had learned. It was his commitment to taking small, consistent steps each day. The mirror had been a safe space to practice, but the real breakthrough came when he started speaking with others. Each conversation, whether with friends, family, or strangers, helped him refine his skills and solidify his confidence. His success was a result of his dedication, his willingness to make mistakes, and his belief that he could improve with time. Ayan's story is a testament to the power of self-belief and perseverance. Whether practicing in front of a mirror, having casual conversations with friends, or joining language exchange programs, every effort counts. For anyone struggling with learning a new language, Ayan's journey shows that no step is too small. Every word learned, every sentence spoken, and every moment of practice brings you closer to fluency. With time, patience, and practice, you can break through the barriers of fear and hesitation and become fluent in English, just as Ayan did. Here is the expanded version of the continuation of Ayan's story, emphasizing how he made learning English enjoyable, incorporating the strategies he used to improve his language skills, and pushing the word count to around 1,300 words. It follows the journey of how Ayan integrated English into his daily life in a meaningful way. With his vocabulary growing steadily and his confidence in speaking improving, Ayan began to realize that learning English wasn't just about memorizing words or practicing pronunciation. It was also about understanding the language deeply, feeling comfortable with it, and being able to use it in a natural, effortless way. To truly improve, he knew he had to go beyond just the basics and make English a part of his everyday life. At first, Ayan had been focused on the mechanics of language, memorizing vocabulary, practicing speaking, and reading to improve his grammar. But he felt that something was still missing. He needed to immerse himself more in the language, to learn in a way that didn't feel like a chore, but rather an enjoyable experience. After all, if learning English felt like a task, it would be harder to stay motivated in the long run. One day, while chatting with his friend Zara, Ayan mentioned his frustrations. "I feel like I'm learning all the time, but I'm still not where I want to be," he said, rubbing his temples. Zara, who was fluent in English and had always been supportive of Ayan's progress, smiled at him. "Have you tried making learning fun? You need to surround yourself with the language and make it part of your daily routine. Watch things you like, read what interests you, and listen to podcasts or music that you enjoy. When you enjoy the content, you'll naturally improve without even realizing it." Ayan thought about it. He had always focused on textbook methods and formal study sessions, but Zara's advice made sense. What if he could learn English while doing something he loved? That evening, he decided to take action. Instead of forcing himself to study grammar rules or memorizing lists of words, he would find a way to integrate English into his everyday routine in a way that was both fun and practical. The next day, Ayan set a goal for himself. He would dedicate at least 20 minutes every evening to watching English language videos, listening to podcasts, or reading articles on subjects that he found interesting. This new approach would allow him to engage with the language naturally while also learning things he enjoyed. He wasn't going to force himself to follow strict learning methods anymore. Instead, he wanted to make learning English something that he looked forward to, a hobby rather than a task. Ian began with watching short videos on YouTube related to his passion for technology. He was fascinated by the latest advancements in artificial intelligence, robotics, and space exploration. By watching videos in English on these topics, he not only learned more about the things he loved, but also began picking up new vocabulary related to these subjects. He noticed that when he watched videos with subtitles, it helped him connect the words he was hearing with their meanings. This technique allowed him to understand spoken English better and also reinforced the vocabulary he had learned. Over the next few days, Ian incorporated more English content into his life. He started listening to podcasts while commuting to college, choosing topics that excited him, like entrepreneurship and innovation. Listening to native speakers in a casual setting helped him familiarize himself with different accents, idioms, and conversational phrases. At first, it was difficult to follow along, but over time, his ability to understand and process English became much quicker. He also found that the more he listened, the more he could easily repeat the phrases he heard, improving his pronunciation. Ian wasn't just consuming content, he was actively engaging with it. After watching a video or listening to a podcast, he would summarize what he had learned in his own words, either aloud or in writing. This helped reinforce his learning and gave him the opportunity to practice speaking English in a real-world context. He would even challenge himself to incorporate the new vocabulary he had encountered in his daily conversations with friends and family. One of the most enjoyable aspects of Ian's new routine was reading articles in English. He subscribed to blogs and websites related to his interests, including technology, culture, and global news. Reading about topics he was passionate about made it easier for him to focus and engage with the material. Initially, Ian found that he would sometimes need to look up the meaning of certain words, but as he continued to read, the unfamiliar words began to feel less intimidating. The more he read, the better he became at understanding sentence structure, idiomatic expressions, and the flow of natural conversation in English. As the weeks went by, Ian's efforts began to pay off. He was no longer memorizing vocabulary in isolation or practicing grammar rules without context. Instead, he was learning English in a way that was holistic, dynamic, and enjoyable. His vocabulary was expanding, his comprehension was improving, and his speaking skills were becoming more fluid. One evening, as Ian sat in his favorite cafe, sipping on a cup of coffee, he overheard a conversation between two people sitting nearby. They were discussing a topic that Ian had recently read about, the impact of artificial intelligence on the job market. Without thinking, he found himself joining the conversation. His thoughts flowed naturally in English, and he was able to express his opinions clearly and confidently. He couldn't believe how easy it had become. A few months ago, he would have hesitated to jump into such a conversation, worried that his English wasn't good enough. But now, thanks to his consistent practice and the enjoyable routine he had built, Ian felt comfortable engaging in spontaneous discussions in English. The success he experienced in that moment solidified his belief in the power of making learning fun and personalized. By surrounding himself with content he loved, Ian had been able to break through the barriers of traditional language learning. He had found his rhythm, and English practice had become a natural part of his daily life. Ayan's story is a testament to how integrating passion into language learning can have transformative effects. By choosing topics that excited him, whether it was technology, music, or news, he was able to learn English in a way that felt less like studying and more like having fun. The key takeaway for anyone learning English is that you don't have to follow a rigid, one-size-fits-all approach. Find what excites you and learn through that passion. Whether it's through videos, podcasts, books, or conversations, there are countless ways to make English practice enjoyable and meaningful. Ayan's commitment to his learning, along with his ability to integrate English into his daily life, ultimately made him a more fluent and confident speaker. English practice was no longer a task he dreaded, it was something he looked forward to. As his vocabulary expanded and his comprehension improved, he became more engaged with the world around him, confidently participating in conversations and expressing his thoughts clearly. The process, which had once seemed overwhelming and daunting, had transformed into a fun, interactive experience. As Ayan continued to refine his English skills, he quickly realized that there was one crucial aspect he hadn't paid enough attention to: listening. Though his vocabulary had expanded, his speaking had improved, and he was enjoying reading and watching content in English, he still struggled to follow conversations in real time. He could recognize individual words, but when people spoke quickly or used unfamiliar accents, he found himself missing key parts of the conversation. Ayan knew that to become truly fluent, he needed to strengthen his listening skills. He understood that listening was just as important as speaking or reading, and that improving his listening would help him understand different accents, pick up on nuances, and communicate more effectively. So, he decided to make listening a priority in his learning process. He began by dedicating at least 30 minutes a day to listening practice. Rather than just passively listening to English, Ayan actively engaged with the material. He started by listening to English podcasts on topics that interested him: technology, sports, history, and even entertainment. Every time he listened, Ayan focused on understanding the context of the conversation and how the speakers used language in different ways. He was particularly interested in how native speakers used idioms, phrasal verbs, and colloquial language. However, he soon realized that listening to podcasts alone wasn't enough. Sometimes, the speakers' accents were unfamiliar, or they spoke too quickly for him to catch everything. Ayan knew he needed to do something more to hone his listening skills. He decided to take a more interactive approach. One evening, Ayan sat down with his laptop, picked an English language podcast on a subject he was passionate about, and hit play. But instead of just listening passively, he decided to pause the podcast every few minutes to reflect on what he had heard. If there was a word or phrase he didn't understand, he rewound the audio and listened again, trying to grasp its meaning. He even took notes on the vocabulary he encountered, jotting down the context in which it was used. By doing this, Ayan started to notice patterns in how words were used and understood, even if he hadn't known them initially. As time passed, Ayan's commitment to active listening paid off. He didn't just hear the words anymore, he understood them more easily. His ear became more attuned to the rhythm of spoken English. He could now follow conversations, even when people spoke rapidly or used unfamiliar expressions. Ayan didn't stop there. He knew that he could benefit from a more diverse range of listening experiences. He began watching English movies and TV shows, paying close attention to how the characters interacted, how they used language, and how they emphasized certain words for effect. Movies provided him with more context, helping him understand how words changed depending on the situation and the tone of voice. By watching scenes multiple times, Ayan was able to understand not only the literal meanings but also the emotions behind the dialogue. One evening, while watching a movie in English with his friend Zara, Ayan was excited to notice how much he was understanding without needing subtitles. Zara turned to him and said, "Wow, you're really getting the hang of this, Ayan. You didn't even have to ask me what they were saying this time." Ayan smiled, feeling a sense of pride. It had taken a lot of work, but he was finally starting to enjoy the process. He reflected on how far he'd come since he first started learning English. What had once felt intimidating and overwhelming now felt like a rewarding challenge. To further challenge himself, Ayan began listening to English news broadcasts. He realized that the language used in the news was often formal, fast-paced, and filled with jargon. At first, Ayan found it difficult to keep up with the reporters, but he was determined to improve. He listened to short news clips every day and used the internet to find transcripts of the broadcasts. By reading along with the news stories while listening to them, Ayan could see how the words were pronounced, how sentences were structured, and how different accents shaped the sound of English. Over time, Ayan found that his listening skills improved dramatically. He no longer had to pause the audio to replay sections or look up as many words. He was able to keep up with the fast pace of conversations, whether it was casual talk among friends or the formal language of a news report. His comprehension was sharper, and he could now understand a wide range of accents from different parts of the English-speaking world. Whether it was an American accent, British, Australian, or even a more neutral international English, Ayan could grasp the meaning without feeling overwhelmed. Ayan felt a sense of accomplishment every time he watched a new movie or listened to a podcast without feeling lost. He was no longer afraid of English speakers talking too fast or using slang. Instead, he enjoyed participating in conversations and felt more confident about his ability to understand and respond. This improvement in his listening skills not only made him feel more comfortable, but also gave him a deeper appreciation for the richness of the language. One particular experience stood out to him. Ayan had joined a group of students for a study session, where they were discussing a research project in English. While the others were talking about the details of their project, Ayan found himself fully engaged in the conversation. He could understand every word they said, and he felt confident enough to add his thoughts. Before, he would have been hesitant to speak in such an environment, afraid that he wouldn't understand or wouldn't be able to keep up with the discussion. But now, Ayan had become a more active participant in conversations, confident in his ability to understand and communicate in English. Looking back on his progress, Ayan realized how much he had grown. His journey from struggling to speak and understand English to confidently engaging in conversations had been challenging, but incredibly rewarding. He had learned that improving his listening skills didn't happen overnight. It was the result of consistent practice and exposure to a variety of English-language media, podcasts, movies, news, and conversations that had allowed him to strengthen his ear for the language. Ayan's experience showed him that listening was not just about hearing words. It was about comprehending meaning, recognizing patterns, and understanding context. He had learned to be patient with himself, to embrace mistakes, and to view each listening challenge as an opportunity to improve. For those learning English, Ayan's journey is a reminder that listening skills are just as important as speaking, reading, or writing. The more you listen to real-life conversations, podcasts, movies, and news, the easier it becomes to understand and communicate. And most importantly, enjoy the process. Make it fun. Whether you're listening to a podcast about a topic you're passionate about or watching a movie in English, your listening skills will improve as long as you stay consistent, engaged, and curious. In the end, Ayan's story proves that improving your English doesn't have to be a daunting task. With the right strategies, practicing vocabulary, speaking regularly, immersing yourself in content you love, and working on your listening, you can become more confident and fluent in English. And just like Ayan, you can reach a point where understanding English feels as effortless as breathing.